Laruelle talks about the human sciences as empirical sciences, but then he goes on to say that, in fact, this is a false designation. The human sciences are not really sciences because they have no real object, no real method, and no theoretical justification. And they're not empirical as well because the so-called experiences that they use to confirm their theories are ideological constructs. So that's the thesis of the human sciences as pseudo-sciences in Laruelle's perspective. I'd like to go back to a quote from the preceding book, The Principle of Minority, that may make this point of view a little clearer and in more concise form. So I'll just translate with very little commentary. The object of the transcendental technology, so that's his perspective in a biography of ordinary man. He's been mainly calling it a transcendental science. It's also a transcendental technology. It's also a transcendental project or a transcendental research program. So the object of the transcendental technology is no longer to describe ideal a prioris corresponding to the regional and general facticities of history, of art, of perception, of science, of power, etc., as a Husserlian perspective on regional ontologies would have set out to do. This transcendental technology considers that everything which was characterized in history as empirical is already very idealized, that it contains formality and ideality in the state of form, presence, identity, or universality, but that inversely, every ideality, because of its transcendence, deserves to be treated empirically and reduced. So we have the so-called empirical sciences, and they contain self-consciously ideal elements, but on this layer cake model, they supposedly take their departure from and come back to empirical elements. And Laruelle is saying that this, as we said last time, this empirical layer is not really empirical. It's pre-contaminated, pre-pervaded, pre-constituted by all sorts of ideal elements. And so it cannot be considered to be empirical or validated by experience or even falsified by experience when we talk about rival hypotheses. At the same time, it contains idealities that receive or can receive legitimation from an a priori level of idealities. And Laruelle is advocating taking this a priori transcendental level and making it empirical, submitting it to the test of experience. So he's not just saying that about philosophy as we've known it. It's clear his idea is if we subject philosophical idealities to the test of experience, they won't hold up. But then we've seen that his idea of experience is, in his theoretical project, transcendental experience. So he's taking his own ideas, as he expounds them in his books, and saying that they must be put to the test of experience. So they're empirical in that sense, although not in the ordinary sense that we think of for empirical and what we think of as experience. So this is basically the point of view that I've been developing on my blog for many years now. Laruelle calls his whole project a transcendental science or a transcendental research program or project. And this is the point of view I have been maintaining. So I've been working within non-philosophy without necessarily appealing to Laruelle all this time, and nobody's noticed it. The only thing that may hide the fact that it's non-philosophy is that I make a tiny substitution where Laruelle talks about transcendental research program. I follow Karl Popper and I call it a metaphysical research program. So a metaphysical research program contains both ideal, non-empirical, non-testable elements and empirical, testable elements, with the finality of making as many of the ideal elements as possible testable in the long run. I use the word metaphysical in a sense that's not at all the use of metaphysical in the French tradition and in Laruelle's usage, but then I'm free to use whatever word I want, as long as I specify, as I always do, that I'm using the word in a usage that doesn't correspond to Laruelle's, but that corresponds to Popper's usage and to a whole tradition that comes after Popper. So that makes Laruelle more visible as a contribution to at least a part of Anglo-American philosophy, and that's another reason I use it. A third reason that I call what I'm doing and as the analysis of metaphysical research programs, including Laruelle's, is that this gives me a basis, a transcendental basis, in fact, for accepting or rejecting, for transcendental reasons, particular theses, and even, as we've seen here, vocabulary and terminology that Laruelle puts forward. That is to say, I can say, but I don't usually do so, because I don't want to be considered to be subservient to a particular philosophical authority, but I could say with perfect rigor and justification that all that I've been doing on my blog is non-philosophy, and I could say that my transcendental experiences are different from Laruelle's, and I could come to critique Laruelle's so-called empirical experience in the new sense, which includes the transcendental idealities rendered testable, as infiltrated with these anthropological mixtures, and that he considers need to be purified out of the new thought and the new paradigm. So that's a methodological remark both for him and for me. So we'll continue with what we were doing last time. I'll just make another methodological remark at the bottom of, that was the French, at the bottom of page 2, after analyzing the non-empirical and the nature of the sciences of man and their essential failure, because they have no real object man and they have no real science, because of the type of combination that they set up between man in the plural as real, and so the necessity of plurality of human sciences, and so the absence of a science of man, and then the presence of sciences, human sciences or methods as real, and so the absence of man as real. So here at the bottom of the page, Laruelle does a move. Perhaps the arrangement should be inverted. If science is to cease to be a techno-political fantasy and become a real science, it must be unique and specific, and it is man who must be irreducible in his multiplicity. So this perhaps, Nietzsche might call it a dangerous perhaps, is a counter-inductive leap. It's been the human sciences have been proceeding in a particular way and claiming rigor and empiricality for their way of proceeding. And Laruelle says, I'm going to take a leap with the same matrix of elements, that is to say, unity, plurality, man, science, that we can consider to be a simple matrix, and I'm going to make a different combination. And this is exactly the mode of procedure that we see constantly in Zizek. He'll say, blah, 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 this is the way it's always done. And then he says, but what if precisely the opposite? What if precisely the inverse is the case? And he just takes the leap, and the only justification, at least at the beginning, is the what if. Suddenly he asks us to suppose the inverse thesis or the inverse procedure, and then the justification must come later with the application and the working out of this counter-inductive leap. So we talked about the double poverty of the sciences of man. So either man is an gaseous, I called it, indeterminate plurality, or reduced to the mineral unity of a nebula. So man then, and he is going to use Foucault and Althusser on the anti-humanist side, and then in a way use Althusser against Foucault all in one short sentence. He says they, the human sciences, reveal that they are nothing but an artifact, the foam that the wave of other sciences left on the terra incognita of man. So the human sciences, like the face of man itself, the human sciences are just the foam on the wave of the preceding physical sciences, and man is erased or effaced as a figure on the sand when the wave and the foam of the human sciences strikes the sand and effaces man. And that's his way of encapsulating Foucauldian vision of the human sciences. And then he's, as we said yesterday, he considers Foucault is just sort of summarizing the inevitable over the centuries and the millennia consequence of Greek philosophical thought, and he's replying in a sort of Althusserian mode, but there's another continent, and this is what Althusser would not accept. This continent is man, but still he's relativizing the conclusions that Foucault can draw. So they're not at all inevitable in the absolute. They're inevitable within the confines of the Greco-philosophical project. And then another project is possible, and for Laruelle necessary, and with him already begun, and that's the other continent. So he goes on and sort of repeats himself, but tries to push a little deeper in his critical analysis of the human sciences. Even combined, they still do not form a science with an object and autonomous and theoretically justified methods. So before, on page 1, he talked about a theoretically justified description, and now he's talking about theoretically justified methods. But in both cases, the theoretical justification is both transcendental and empirical in the new sense. There's a transcendental argument as to the nature of the new science of ordinary man, and theorems can be developed out of that. And at the same time, these theorems are meant to correspond or correlate with or be identical with the order of experience. So if ever the experience is in conflict with the theorems, Laruelle will be obliged to take that into account and abandon a theorem, or modify the theorem, or modify the scope of the theorem. So he's not immunizing himself from empirical tests, but as with the invitation to engage in a discussion with him at the right level, the transcendental level, what would count as an empirical test for Laruelle is a series of transcendental experiences. So he goes on to describe the human sciences as imaginary phenomena. So we've got the imaginary, we've got Althusser's critique of ideology in the background. We do not recognize them according to their own existence, because this existence, is a simple, blurred institutional network, nourished by its own plasticity, surviving only from compromise. So we're back to the institutional indignity or disgrace that Laruelle mentions in the foreword, that there are institutionalized disciplines and departments that shouldn't exist. They're sort of bootstrapping themselves in a negative way into existence, and each is reinforcing the other in a interdisciplinary mutual recognition. And that's a compromise formation for him, but it's an imaginary, perhaps even in the Lacanian sense, it's an imaginary version of what a real science should be. So he considers there a caricature. He continues, or they can be as a caricature of contemporary philosophical powerlessness and nihilism, with a fantastical and mythical figure of man, with no necessity other than the context. Well, the word in French is conjoncture, and I think probably that would go better there. I don't see the context, it's a bit unclear what that means, but the conjuncture, with its connotations of situated political problematic field in a particular constellation of power and knowledge, is probably more relevant. I mean, we're still using a sublimated, maybe radicalized, intensified, transvaluated, and transcendentalized set of concepts that are derived from Althusser. And I think we're not children, I would say to the translators. We've got a not too jargony, but a jargony text here, and we can cope with it. We can cope with the word conjuncture. There's no need to weaken it into this gaseous word context. Laruelle is saying we don't want gaseous words, and we don't want mineral, crystallized out words either. That's the defect of the human sciences. So maybe conjuncture would be okay there. So he's saying human sciences are conjunctural. They're politically and cognitively instrumentalized, rather than achieving the sort of universality we're obliged to say in universality in the good sense. We could say the sort of untimeliness that would belong to a real science in his eyes. Here comes a strange generalization of his critique, because he's been talking about the human sciences up to now, and then he comes to sort of not exactly critique necessarily, but a warning. Every science that comes into being strains to capture all of reality. S'efforce in French, I would say strives to capture. Strain, why not? But it's sort of a little overdoing it. Strives to capture all of reality, and is animated by the old mytho-philosophical ambition of identifying the whole with the real, totality with the absolute. So every science that comes into being, maybe you could use the Althusserian notion of spontaneous ideology. Laruelle is saying that for every science that comes into being, it is accompanied by or pervaded by the spontaneous ideology of trying to account for everything and of taking this, in fact never achieved, but phantasmatic account of everything, this totality, this cognitive totality, as being identical with the real. So when science starts out, it's already imagining its ideal point of convergence as a theory of everything. And Laruelle is saying that for reasons of principle, even a theory of everything would not be a theory or a science of the absolute. So we have the two elements of the spontaneous ideology of science or of scientists. One, to explain everything, and two, to consider that everything once explained would be the absolute, that the totality that they project, a totality of convergence, would be the absolute. So that's the two elements of the spontaneous ideology of science that he isolates here. Like the others, the most recent, ethnology, linguistics, biology, and the science of history. So the others must be physics and mathematics and chemistry, for example. So like the others, the most recent, ethnology, linguistics, biology, and the science of history, in the Marxist sense, do not emerge without attempting to moor man, considered as a remainder to their continent or to their raft. So he's riffing off Althusser's notion of physics as constituting a new continent, and the Marxist science of history as constituting a new continent. And he's sort of validating that vision of what a science is, and then he's minimizing it. He's saying it's not even a continent, it's just a raft. Whereas what Laruelle is doing is going to a fully extended and imminent continent, the continent of the ordinary man. He says a series of deferred actions or anthropological artifacts results from this, and each time man is declared fully accounted for. So this is a theory of the sciences, the human sciences. I suppose he may be relimiting it back to the human sciences in the broader sense. They're a mess. They're a mess in their sort of partial and fragmentary objects. They're a mess in their methods. They're a mess in the way they justify theoretically their objects and their methods. And then there's, as a deferred action, or as a anthropological artifact, as a sociological or a social construct, they reconstruct their mess into a rational whole. So they're constantly proceeding by rational reconstruction to, in fact, cover over hide or cover over the actual conceptual pseudo-empirical mess that is what is actually going on. And that way they can, each time man is declared fully accounted for. So we've got the full account of man. We've got the theory of everything human at an imaginary level. So what Laruelle is trying to do is, by getting to what he calls the real object of the continent that all these human sciences are trying to describe without even knowing that it exists. So by means of man, Laruelle is trying to put forward not a theory of everything, not a unified field theory, but he is trying to describe the transcendental field of ordinary man. And so later he will use the replacement concept of unary. So it's a unary science. It's just one science. It's not unitary. It's not totalized under a transcendent concept of totality, but he's proposing a unary field theory, or a unary transcendental field theory. Okay, he says all those universals, all the universals that we've got to in the human sciences, he's not invalidating them as such, he's invalidating their pretensions. These universals can be useful, can have their regional validity, but he's not going to transcendentalize and universalize that regional validity, nor is he, within the regions circumscribed, going to validate the so-called empirical data, because he's going to say the empirical data is constantly pre-formatted, idealized, and formalized. So, but all these universals, even gathered together by the state in the nebula of the social sciences. So we have this word nebula again, and the nebula is a false unity. All sorts of things are grouped together in a nebula just by proximity and the force of gravitational attraction. Nebula is a heterogeneous astronomical object, but has its de facto gravitational proximate unity, and that's all. So even when you gather all that together, even when the state gathers all that together in the social sciences, it's still not the beginning for a specific science of man. So we have the human sciences that establish man as living being, historical being, speaking being, sexuated being, and so on. And as a secondary layer, the state tries to form even more useful sciences, the social sciences, from these already imaginarily constructed, non-empirical human sciences. And so it's even less empirical, less unified, they're less sciences even than the human sciences that could have a certain degree of scientificity attributed to them, especially if they were capable of seeing their little place in the big picture. He says that a genealogy of the sciences of man would show that they stem from the same archaic metaphysical presuppositions as rational psychology, the cogito, ontological presuppositions in general, combined with others, that is to say, other presuppositions that are necessary for their mathematization. So he's saying that the human sciences, especially as re-instrumentalized by the state, are a mixture of pseudo-empirical predicates, not just anthropological predicates or presuppositions, but ontological presuppositions. He mentions simplicity, atomicity, substantiality, causality, which are simply pluralized. So you take some philosophical notions, simplicity, atomicity, substantiality, causality, and you say, that's philosophy, but we can use that and we can make it scientific. We'll just pluralize it. So that's a very insufficient procedure for Laruelle. And also, we'll mathematize it, and that'll make it scientific. So Laruelle is absolutely against this sort of mathematization, which we find again in philosophy. That's one of his beefs against Badiou, but it's not clear that his objection is valid there. But for the principle, Laruelle is against this, what he calls a little lower, this cheap mathematization, or rabais in French, so that means cheap. But another way of saying the thought would be this dumbed down mathematization. So we see that more and more frequently in continental philosophical circles. It's what I call mathematical reductionism. Quite often, sometimes it's mathematicians who think they have the key to everything because they've got an extensive and deep knowledge of mathematics that other people don't have, and so they can talk about philosophy and really know what is good and bad procedure in philosophy. But more often you get this strange compromise formation of artists or literary people who have mastered a certain degree of advanced mathematics and then project that onto the idea of non-philosophy, or here what we'll call the transcendental science of ordinary man. So because they're artists, they have the empirical. I mean, let's try and analyze this composite. Because they're artists, they think they have the empirical level to a greater degree. And because they've worked on advanced mathematics, they think they have the conceptual level, although it's just mathematical. And that's not what Laruelle is going for. That's why often people find that Laruelle's use of science and mathematics is simplistic. Some even think it's just plain wrong. But he's not to be reinforced by more mathematics, by more quantum theory. He's trying to get away from the whole posture of cheap mathematization and pseudo-experience. So that's why later on he'll introduce the concept that he doesn't have here of the generic, though one could argue that it's implicit here, because one could argue that in this book, or despite all his talk about science, it's still in the air, it's still indeterminate and gaseous. And his answer to that will come later, in that he's using generic concepts. So that's part of what the quote I read from the Minority Principle is about, and part of what this passage we're reading today is about. They're generic and they can't be captured in the universals. Generic and universal are not at all the same concept. And the other attempt to give more validity to his talk of science is, so it's generic, it's not science internal to itself, and which would be a circle, by the way, and it's quantum, but in a totally generic form of quantum thought. The actual details are most of the time, for most of the details, not very important for Laruelle, but there's just enough of the quantum way of thinking in his use of quantum to allow for sort of just enough physical and mathematical formalization, just a tiny bit. It's like weak transcendence. There's just enough of it to give weight to his seemingly gaseous idea of science without crystallizing it down into the mineral unity of a nebula. Of course, mathematics is a nebula, a whole lot of different things. And quantum physics, if you look at it, is a nebula. And then we stick on words like mathematics or quantum theory, and that gives it a mineral unity, but still a nebula. So he doesn't want to be in the gaseous, over-sublimated realm that some of his concepts may seem to be for the moment, because it's an ongoing research program, and he doesn't want to crystallize them down into a mineral unity. And so he's going for this liquid, these waves. He's always talking about waves later, but he's already talking about the foam of the wave. That's the human sciences are just the foam of the wave, but his philosophy comes in waves. So it's neither gaseous nor mineral, but it's this other thing that, for the purposes of transcendental intuition, he calls a wave. So he says, smatterings of ancient philosophy, of politics, of rational psychology are externally reunited by the process and security of a cheap mathematization. So I feel uncomfortable with the translation externally reunited. Not sure exactly what that means, unless I keep in mind the French, réunifié de l'extérieur. So they're not just reunited, they're reunified, réunifié, de l'extérieur, from the outside. So we're getting a unification, not just a union. We're getting a unification, at least projected, at least in imaginary form. We're getting a unification, but that doesn't come from the material, but that comes from outside demands, interests, concepts, affects, and that's why another reason why the sciences of man, or the human sciences, are not sciences. They don't have the requisite autonomy, and it can be demonstrated. You can do ideology critique and show that the necessary autonomy is not there. This generalized intersection creates the techno-political wealth, that is to say, the real vacuity of this bric-a-brac, equally devoid of theoretical rigor and humanity, and for the same reasons. Okay, first, do we really say bric-a-brac in English all that often? I mean, it's used in English. In French, it wouldn't even make people lift an eyebrow. I probably use it a couple of times a month, maybe. I mean, why not? It's totally banal in French. In English, it's a borrowed word. Why not? It means basically a disordered mixture, which is what he's been saying all along. So we've got a generalized intersection of the human sciences, and so interdisciplinary approach, and that creates technopolitical wealth. So we're in the power-knowledge complex, and it seems incredibly promising. It has lots of ideas and theories and new techniques coming up all the time. So it's a phantasmatic wealth, and it's a real vacuity. And one of the reasons is that it's disordered. It's just a hodgepodge. Maybe we could have said hodgepodge instead of bric-a-brac. It's just a hodgepodge of concepts, presuppositions, prejudices, cheap mathematization that is, in the ultimate analysis, vacuous. And he comes back to his ritornello. It's equally devoid of theoretical rigor and humanity. They're the two things that he's trying to unite in this book, and for the same reasons. So he talked about this lack of rigor and lack of humanity for the same reasons. In the forward, he's going maybe here to justify what he means by the same reasons, because he didn't before. So he says, because, new sentence, but it seems to be developing these same reasons. Because the essence of the science of man remains unthought, its rigorous phenomenal content having been forgotten. It is reconstructed from practical and theoretical elements, which are effective elsewhere, but here there's no necessity. It's on the sole arbitrary authority of the expert. So it's reconstructed from practical theoretical elements. That was what we were talking about before. It's a rational reconstruction, which is a sort of masking procedure. It's a mess, but you manage to reconstruct things to give it some sort of apparent form and unity. And the essence of the science of man remains unthought because its rigorous phenomenal content has been forgotten. So the rigorous phenomenal content is what he calls in the forward the order of experiences, the phenomenal content, which is rigorous in his idea of rigor, has been forgotten. We've forgotten the real experiences, and we've substituted pseudo experiences full of imaginary mixtures and imaginary unifications. And so it's not rigorous because we just got this hodgepodge of elements. And it's not human because we're not getting real human experience. We're getting artifacts of experience that are necessary for the sciences to get going. I'm not sure what he's thinking of. We can imagine, for example, the use of polls and surveys to get people to say what they're thinking and what they're feeling, and then we can do statistics with that. That's the cheap mathematization, and sometimes it could produce interesting results, and sometimes it can be just totally wide of the mark. There is still no necessary connection between the sciences of man and their object, no theoretical foundation to assure the connection and make it necessary. So it's the same objection. We don't have an object in the human sciences. The object, the only one that's worthwhile and real, is man, ordinary man, minorities, or dispersive multiplicities, another synonym, or the absolute. So we don't have the object for the continent, the scientific continent that it is supposedly exploring. But the human sciences stay on the old continent and decompose along with their pseudo-man, pseudo-object. But they pretend they're exploring the new continent. And so there's no necessary connection between these sciences and their object, because both are bric-a-brac. And so the connections are sort of gerrymandered connections. There's no theoretical foundation. This is what Laruelle is doing in his book, giving us a theoretical foundation for the science of man. And he considers that if he gives this theoretical foundation, he will have set up the notion of man, the new continent, the concept of man, and the science, and established the necessary connection, established the connection between the two, and established that it's a necessary connection. That's his proclamation. He asked the question, how to set up a rigorous science of man, established in a rigor specific to theory as such, that is to say, in the experience of the full and phenomenally positive sense of theoria. So here he's back to experience again. We want to set up a rigorous science of man with the rigor specific to theory. And so, with the experience of the full and phenomenally positive sense of theoria or theoria. So, when we're doing theory in the full and positive sense, we're experiencing ourselves in a transcendental experience. We're experiencing ourselves as doing, at last, theory in the full and positive sense. It's a phenomenal, in this purified transcendental sense, but it's a phenomenal experience. Here, I, Laruelle, and you, the reader, if you're following along, we're doing theory, and it's not self-confirming as such, because you can think without this experience, I suppose, but that risks of producing a void of sense, a real vacuity. But you think, and you have at the same time the experience of thinking, of theory, with a capital T, by the way, and in Latin to make it even clearer and more important. Okay, a science that would no longer borrow its means of investigation, demonstration, and validation from existing sciences. Well, that's obvious. He's just shown it's a mess. So we can't borrow its methods and its proofs from existing sciences. It's got to be specific, based in the specific essence of the object, in the truth of the object. The discovery of the science of man and the discovery of the real essence of man are the same thing. So we've got a sort of chiasma there, A, B, B, A. The specific essence of the object, the truth of the object, A, B. The discovery of the science of man, B. And the discovery of the real essence of man are the same thing. So it sounds circular as well, or self-justifying, but he's asserting something even stronger than a circle. He's sort of squishing the circle and saying that if you've got, if you've discovered the science of man and you've discovered the real essence of man, well, if you've done one, you've done the other, and vice versa. Because, or one of the reasons, is that the science is absolutely specific to the object. It has a full and real autonomy. And secondly, the object is not just an object. The science of man is in the two senses of the genitive of. The science of man is the science about man, and it is man's or humans' science. Instead of human sciences, as human apostrophe S, humans, or humans with an apostrophe after the S is maybe even better. Human science. It's part of man, of the human, to have this this science of itself, and that's the sign, if you will, or the criterion, or criterion. If you in doing the theory are staying, remember he said soutenir before, you are maintaining yourself in the element or in the real essence of man, then you're doing the real theory of man, the real science of man.